Hey, welcome to Ask a Pastor today. I'm joined by George Palombo to my right, who is a member of our pastoral staff here at Orchard Hill on our Wexford campus. He also has 30 years in law enforcement. And then by Gene Boyer, who is a member, active participant in our Strip District location, and a newer friend of mine, but somebody I've gotten to know just a little bit. And if you're listening on the radio, Gene is also an African American, and we wanted to today just talk about race, especially in light of some of the issues that have been happening in our country here in the last little bit. So, Gene, just give us a little bit just of your backstory, just kind of how you got to where you are today, and then we'd love just to jump into this topic.
Sure. First of all, thank you both for allowing me to share the time. And Kurt, thank you for the leadership that you've shown since the service I attended last Sunday morning and everything that's led up to and gone through. So thanks for everything and happy to be here. I first encountered Orchard Hill in a completely different time in my life. Hard to believe, coming up on 14 years ago now, and a group of men who didn't have to give the slightest hint of a darn about me did more than give me a darn. They loved me till I could love myself again. And one of those guys, Mo Wimbish, who we all have had the privilege of knowing, who's no longer with us, literally refused to let me go. So I have a long and deep love for this church and a reason for my faith in this church, but strength and faith in God, and reconnected with Orchard Hill in 2017 when I moved back from Virginia. I am a real estate developer and construction manager. Really kind of an unexpected transition, about 10 years sooner than I thought it would be, but construction in some essence has been my life's work for the last almost quarter of a century. I grew up in Monroeville. We moved here in '72 after the steel building was completed. My dad was a plant engineer at the Fairless Works, and they consolidated engineering from around the country into so many floors in the U.S. Steel building. That brought us here. And with the exception of a hiatus in Los Angeles in the 90s and 3 years in Northern Virginia in the mid-2000s, Pittsburgh has been my home. And proud to be from here, love this city, bleed black and gold.
It is a great city that people who are not from Pittsburgh do not realize what a great place it is.
No, they do not.
It's
a great big small town in a lot of ways, but we're a scared, hurting, and broken town right now.
Yeah.
And it's conversations like this that are going to be the center piece of any reconciliation that we ultimately have.
Yeah. So let's start with maybe the easiest piece of this, and that is George Floyd's life was taken from him, and I think it would be easy to say that it doesn't take a lot to say that's a horrific thing to observe, to watch, to say.
You would think, wouldn't you?
From any perspective, that's hard. I think what I hear and see is that I haven't heard people try to defend that. I'm sure there are, but I haven't heard a lot of that. But what you often hear is, well, that's isolated, or there's other issues or things like that that play into it. And I guess what would be interesting, especially with somebody who's in law enforcement, is help us understand what goes into, George, if you could, a stop, and how something could go wrong to the point where somebody maybe is so enraged that they feel the need to use force.
Well, I would say there are a number of things that could go wrong. First of all, I mean, it's something as simple as a traffic stop for a police officer automatically puts the police officer in yellow alert. As soon as I begin to pull a motor vehicle over, my sensory perception goes into sort of a yellow mode. because I've been trained and, I've seen the videos and I want to go home at night. So immediately, my guard is up. And I think rightfully so. I don't think that there's anything wrong. I have often heard many trainers in law enforcement say that as police officers, you live in yellow mode. And it's probably something I haven't even completely gotten rid of today, which is why I didn't want to be in the middle of you guys here. but at any rate, there are a number of things that can go wrong just in the attitude that you begin to put together as you walk towards a vehicle where you know that there may be a threat on the other side, and you simply don't know what to expect. So you're looking, you're watching, and if anything even begins to raise your ire just a teeny weeny bit, the police officer's posture changes a little bit. He may begin to turn sideways a little bit as he approaches a vehicle, just because he's being, cautious for maybe right reasons or for maybe wrong reasons. He's a human being, and as he approaches that vehicle, it could happen that he could, just a simple act of maybe resting his hand, on his weapon as he walks over. But in a protective mode, there are just innumerable things that could go wrong, and it's about being prepared for all of those things that could potentially happen.
So one of the things I heard a friend of mine say, who's African American, is he said, I've been able a lot of times to say, well, maybe something went wrong. When I watched George Floyd, I felt like there was no possible explanation.
Yeah, I would probably be speaking, I pray to God I'm speaking for 99, I'd pray to God that I'm speaking for 100% of law enforcement who watched that video and they were just aghast at what they saw take place, at the lack of respect for humanity.
Let me ask a question. And I have said, listen, we've all been through different phases in our lives, right? There was a time when I wasn't all that thrilled to see the police, period, and maybe with some legitimacy in my 20s. In my 40s, as a business owner, invested in my community, I want to see the police. What has been interesting to me, though, and I've said it, listen, walking up on a car when you don't know who's inside of it, you don't know what's in the trunk, you don't know, what? If you got 50 keys of heroin in the trunk of that car that you're transporting for somebody, they may rather square off with you than square off with the guy who put that H in the back of that truck. Okay, understand all of these things. But when racial bias, further intensifies that yellow state, that's where the problem is, and that's where up until now, in my opinion, we have not been willing to be courageous enough to have those conversations. Because if you are not willing to acknowledge your own bias and just be willing to deal with the fact that I'm human, I have a bias, here it is, now let's deal with it, how is that not going to end up in some kind of catastrophic outcome as often as not? It just doesn't make sense as logical thinking people that if we are not willing to face the discomfort of a conversation like this, and shame on us for not doing it 25 years ago after Rodney King. Here we are again, guys. I mean, we're all old enough to remember that. I lived through it. I was in Los Angeles when that happened.
Mm-hmm. So I would say that the difficulty in trying to distinguish and parse that out is that it is nearly impossible, if it's not impossible, to just discern when that takes place for an individual police officer.
Okay, fair enough. Then why can't we just go ahead and stipulate to the fact that after a couple of centuries, actually 4, of systemic racism in this country, that it exists, and let's just work from there. And if you happen to be one of the ones who've evolved above it, God bless you, then you become a leader to your fellow brothers in blue. I don't believe that the majority of police officers support what happened. But the fact still remains that a murder took place on primetime television. 3 other police officers stood by and were complicit. And I'm going to submit to you that if it was 4 black police officers and that was a white person in handcuffs on the side of the road under the knee of a black cop, I think all 4 of them would be locked up for first-degree murder right now. And those are systemic. And I'm not attacking you, but I'm saying these are the conversations we need to have, because this is what your black friends and neighbors and colleagues are feeling right now. I run a business. I mean, I'm doing a $50 million friggin' real estate development project in Uptown. Won it competitively, straight up with our design. Okay, I'm working my tail off, and I'm breaking down every 15 minutes and crying, and all I'm doing is spending time on my knees begging God to make some sense out of this. We're not supposed to be doing this in 2020. And so then we have to come back to the fact that we are means that there's still a problem here. So we need to deal with the problem rather than parsing. There shouldn't be parsing. We just need to accept some things that aren't comfortable and go from there. Because as long as we keep trying to step around it, I think we're going to have this conversation a decade from now. Hell, a month from now, maybe.
So help me to understand. Were you going to say something? Help me to understand. Are we to assume that immediately that when a white police officer pulls a black man over there must be
but I think
profiling?
I think there needs to be an awareness that there's an inherent distrust right now, and it's toxic, and it's proving to be fatal. Excuse me, my microphone's moving around here, and it's fatal, and it puts the police officer at risk as well. I want that guy to go home too. He has a wife and a kid. I'm in a business where if somebody makes a mistake 8 floors up, I got to go knock on their wife's door and tell them that her husband's not coming home. Okay, I get it. I want that guy to go home. I want to be safe.
Sure.
I'm going to have to sit down and sign the biggest loan I've ever signed in my life sometime later this summer or early fall to move our project forward, and I'm fully invested. I mean, I am all in with my life. I don't have a trust fund to fall back on if it goes sideways. That's everything I have. So I'm invested in it, and I get he is too. But I think if we don't understand that, and then it can be quickly dispelled. If that white officer understands, okay, there's an inherent distrust here that I may not have had anything to do with, but it just kind of is what it is. Yeah, it stinks, but it is what it is. And then maybe you walk up. Now, if there's a reason to make a move, you make a move. I'm not saying you're supposed to wait and be nice until you die, but I think there is an inherent, like I said, I mean, I got a good job, I got a good life, and it's terrifying for me when there's a police car behind me. It shouldn't be, not in 2020.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I've seen is that as a white man, I probably should have some conversations with my kids about being pulled over by police and how to act. But that isn't top of the mind. And I would assume if you're an African American,
I have a 14-year-old godson, and I've been having this conversation with him since he was 10 years old.
And I think that's what you're driving at in that I don't have the same concern about that interaction that you have, and because of that, that just shows the systemic distrust that exists.
And that's why
there.
I'm saying you shouldn't be put in a position to have to parse it out, is what I'm saying. That officer shouldn't be put in the position to have to parse that out. We should just be able, as adults, as Americans, to say, you know what, it's taken a long time to get here, and it's going to take some time for us to fix it. But right now, let's acknowledge that we're not all on the same page. And let's all just agree that we're going to take a pause, okay? Roll your window down, put both hands on the steering wheel. I just do that instinctively because I want that guy to feel as comfortable as he possibly can, because he doesn't have a friggin' clue who I am. I get it. But I also grew up in Monroeville. I didn't grow up in Homewood or the Hill District, where the cops were more like stormtroopers than they were like peace officers and baseball coaches and football refs. I didn't have that experience that those kids have. So I can't sit here, and my relatively comfortable path to this point doesn't lessen the rage I feel, doesn't lessen the fear that I fear. You know, there's a reason I wore a Laurel Valley golf shirt to Wexford today. I hate that in 2020. It's my church, man. I mean, I've been coming in this building for over a decade. So, yeah, I don't know. I don't have all the solutions, but again, I think the fact that you have the courage to sit here, and we have the courage to talk to each other, and we can root that conversation in a respect based in Christ, right? We're Christians. We're all nobody wants this to happen. Nobody feels good about this. You know, I have several friends who are police officers. They're good guys, you know, but there's a culture, at least it looks like from the outside, and I'd be interested to hear your perspective. It appears that there's a culture of silence and protection. How much does that contribute to some of what's going on? Or am I blowing?
No, you're not.
Okay.
Unfortunately, and I would say this goes across every line in any line of work. There are jerks inside of the police department, and I have met the fella who killed George Floyd in my past, not personally, but I know that guy. I've met him. I've worked on the street with that guy.
Oh, I've met him.
Yeah, you probably have. It is terrifying.
Yep.
But I would add, without discounting what you're saying, is I want you to know it's terrifying for a white police officer to work with that white police officer.
Oh, I imagine it must be.
It's not mitigated.
So then why is that guy forced to keep quiet about that bad apple? If that bad apple's
I'm not
his
forced
life,
to. I'm not forced to keep
Okay.
quiet about it.
Okay.
I shared with Kurt the other day that I've had incidents. I can think of one particular incident in mind where I was called to go and pick up an inmate in one of our local city places, and when I got there, this white police officer had this young African American in a chair, handcuffed behind his back, and he's trying to solicit some irrelevant information from him. It was nothing crucial, and I knew this. I'm discerning this as I'm watching as I walk in, and I'm seeing this go back and forth, and he didn't get what he wanted out of him, and I mean just hauled off and cold cocked this guy while he was sitting there with his handcuffs on him, and I had just walked in. I had no idea of what had transpired in the days or weeks or whatever before him, but I did look at him and say, let me tell you something. If I catch you doing that again to my prisoner, I'm going to arrest you and find out what happened between the two of you later on.
Okay.
And so I picked him up, I took my guy out, and so I've met that guy. But let me say this
Please.
too.
No,
I
no,
knew this guy. I knew this cop. And I also know him to have friends who are African American. And one of the things I shared with Kurt was sometimes it may be through bad timing or bad luck that it is an African American guy who gets the back end of not a racist cop, but a cop who's just a jerk and would be a jerk under any circumstances when he could wield his power instead of his authority.
And I think that's where the next fundamental shift in our thinking and dialogue as a country needs to be. When you are given a badge and a gun, you are given a sacred responsibility.
Absolutely.
You are literally given the power of life and death, with the benefit of the doubt going with death.
Yes.
Okay? Now, when that is what's bestowed upon you, with all due respect, I could not give the slightest hint of a damn about mitigating circumstances. I do expect that individual bestowed that kind of power, that kind of finality. I expect them to operate higher. Oh, he's human. I'm sorry, that doesn't hold water. Because guess what? If all he has is a baton on him, yeah, it turns into a lawsuit, and the taxpayers wind up beating the lawsuit, but chances are that guy lives through it.
Well, I would say this.
I guess the second question I would ask, and I apologize for stepping
it's
on
okay.
it, but the second thing I would ask is, at what point is what transpired prior to relevant at the point where a suspect is restrained and clearly can't defend themselves or be of harm to anybody, including themselves? At what point does what transpired matter?
It's not so much that it matters in long term. I don't know what happened in the short term. Hold on, let me finish that. For the same reason that if you had your ire raised because someone came after your family, this is a couple of things that I do have to consider. I don't know what this young man had done to maybe his partner before I got there. Maybe he took a poke at him. I don't know. I didn't know the background, but I did know this.
Does that justify him being punched in the mouth if he's restrained?
Which is precisely why I said to him, if I catch you doing that again, don't ever do that again in my presence. This is a guy I could have that conversation with on the back end.
And I get that. I guess what I'm saying is a black citizen, because it happens to us a hell of a lot more than it happens to guys that look like you and Kurt. What I'm saying is, at the point you restrain that prisoner, nothing matters. I don't
I
care
agree with
if
that.
you, and what I'm saying is until that's codified and until that's taught from the academy on down, and until my father's 93 years old. My father enlisted in the Army at the end of World War II, okay? When Truman desegregated the Army, it happened like this. We will be a desegregated fighting force in 90 days. Any officer or NCO not willing to go along with that move, I will take your resignation. After that, I will bust you to private. It happened that fast. That's changing the damn military. My father came back from Korea in charge of 1,100 integrated troops. 6 stripes and a diamond at 26 years old. Okay? Still had to ride on the back of a bus in Alabama. So my point is, our history has documented this. In my mind, as a black man, the point where you have me cuffed and I am no longer a threat, I don't care what the hell I did before that. You don't have a right to strike me. And you should be in cuffs. And I'm not saying you should have. Again, there's a cultural thing there. But if we're going,
I don't want you to hear that I justified that police officer's behavior in any way, shape, or form.
Kurt will tell you he's not known me that long, but he knows people who've known me. If I thought you were justifying, trust and believe this would be a very different conversation.
He would say it. You know, for context, I just looked. I think it was the FBI released some data from 2019. Said that there were 19 white men killed in police custody who were unarmed, 9 black men. And if you do the stats on that, that's about 40% of the deaths are black, 45%, and about 15% of the population. And so what that would suggest is that even though people can use that stat to say, well, you know, this happens to everybody, that there's still that proportionately that still is a higher proportion. Now, people would also say, well, you know, that's where people get into the crime stats and start saying, well, there's more crime and some of that to try to say, hey, it is just the bad cop theory, not the race that drives that. And I think that as I've tried to listen, what I hear from people who are African American is that we don't want to hear about the stats because the stories keep coming and it feels as if we are still experiencing significant profiling and prejudice in that arena. And so the bad cop theory, like I hear what you're saying, George, and I think that makes sense to me. Like to go, yeah, there's some people who are going to be jerks to whoever they pull over. They've got power. It doesn't matter. But I think for a lot of people, they would say there's still a color aspect that's informing that, and that's what feels so desperate in this day. Would that be fair, Gene?
I think that's a fair characterization, Kurt, and I appreciate the fact that you're not watering it down either. And I got a lot of respect for you, George. I look forward to us talking and praying together and studying scripture together going forward. I feel that you're a good man, and you're in a difficult position. Again, I understand. I have several friends on the Pittsburgh police force. Good guys. They're just trying to take care of their families, man.
Sure.
They want to go to work, put their 8 in, and go home. Like I said, same way when I send guys up a steel rig, okay, I'm maniacal about safety. I don't care what it costs me, because losing the day if the day, God forbid, ever comes where I have to make that visit, I don't know if I come back from that. You know what I mean? So I understand how serious it is. But I think, again, the beginning of the movement here, the beginning of real change is going to be when we can just accept, look, there's an inherent bias. I mean, the country was built that way. This country was, and again, I'm not even disrespecting our country's heritage. That's the culture of this country.
So one of the things that maybe to some people who hear this conversation and say, but wait a second, might say, is they might say, okay, I get that there has been profiling, race, prejudice, whatever you want to call it, toward African-American individuals because somebody had an experience somewhere or they had it portrayed this way, systemic racism, whatever you want to call it, that led to this. But then isn't the same thing being done to the police right now where you take a few bad cops who have taken something and done what they shouldn't, and now painted the entire force a certain way. And so what would you say to that? I'd be interested in both of your takes on that.
I want to hear what George thinks, because I've had a lot to say, and he's been very gracious in allowing me the floor. So, please.
I probably was expecting Gene to answer this question and didn't pay probably quite close enough
I'm sorry
attention
about that.
just to the way that you put the question together.
So the question is, if prejudice is basically saying, I have one experience and therefore I paint everybody who is like that person as the same thing. So racially, some people have prejudiced because maybe they had a bad experience or just were taught that, they had a certain ability, so they said all people are this way. Then what about the criticism that says, hey, there's some cops that have chosen to act poorly, and now they're prejudiced against all cops? And I'm just asking that question, yeah.
I would say, and honestly, there are a few thin lines to probably parse out. One is, for example, and maybe this is where our faith can even enter into this conversation, is I remember as a young man when I became a Christian. I was probably 23 or 24 years old, and I will never forget, and I'll get to what you were saying, but I will never forget when I truly began to understand the gravity of the gospel. And now I had to be able to reconcile that with being a police officer, because I didn't take a posture of gentleness and respect all the time. I grew up, I was raised to be a respectful young man, but I knew this was going to be a game changer, because I knew that I was going to be confronted with some of the same scenarios that were violent. And how do I now reconcile acting like a believer inside of some of those violent confrontations that I knew were coming? And so I struggled with that for a number of months. And truthfully, at the end of the day, it wasn't difficult. I made it difficult. I knew what to do. Okay. I knew how to act. It was the application of doing what is right that became elusive to me, at least for a small season. So what I would say is, probably for an unbeliever, someone who does not know the Lord in any capacity, who just may be a decent guy, the stereotyping of police officers makes them it puts their teeth on edge, because it does make them crawl into their own community and begin to view everything as being an outsider. Like nobody understands what we're going through. I don't think that's a fair thing to do, but I think it's a natural thing to do. I think it's natural for a community to say, nobody understands where we are coming from. Therefore, we must band together and protect one another at all costs. Do I agree with that? No, my faith doesn't allow me to maintain that position past camaraderie. Gotcha. Does that make sense?
It does, and I appreciate it. That's a very thoughtful and very honest answer, and I appreciate that, because, I can. Those statements resonate with me. A couple of things I'll say around that. I think this goes back to, again, a systemic breakdown in leadership from the top down. With all due respect, I really don't care who's offended by the following statements. The fact that a sitting president is calling on governors to dominate their citizens. I wasn't a George W. Bush fan, but God knows after 9/11, he unified this country. I even watched him reach out to Muslim imams and talk to them, because there were good imams who were as horrified as, Christians were. It would happen. All I've heard from this president, who none of the people he loves, police officers, National Guardsmen, none of his children are in the line of fire. None of them are being put in harm's way. I'm heartened by the fact that the majority of governors are pushing back, but regardless of what's going on, and I'm not for a second condoning the violence, because I think we all can agree the majority of these protesters are peaceful and they have righteous intentions. There's a handful of bad actors. As long as crossing state lines becomes a federal offense, doesn't include people who cross the state lines to advance freedom and racial justice, I'm all for it. But from the standpoint of how we move forward, until leadership from the top down says, okay, we just got to push pause. We do have issues. We're sorry. I may not personally hold those issues, but I get that they're here. So here's what we're going to do together. We're going to work together. And you know what you're going to find? The black community knows who the bad actors are. They'll call them out and hand them to you. They don't want this aggravation. You think I want to look over my shoulder driving to my own damn church in Wexford? I mean, come on. My girlfriend lives 10 minutes from here. I gotta go out of my way, take my mask off, and smile at all her damn neighbors so somebody doesn't make an unsolicited call to the cops, and I'm suddenly find myself on the wrong end of a conversation with a terrified cop who's scared of COVID-19, scared of my mask, scared of being there. Here's this white lady. Oh my God, what do I do? And then a tragedy happens, and we're sitting there saying, "How did it happen?" Because he was a good guy. Yeah, he was a good guy in a bad spot because his own leadership sold him out.
Well, and race doesn't know politics. You know, one of the things that we know for sure is that the lady who called the police in Central Park was a big Hillary Rodham Clinton supporter.
Still used it.
And so it's not, you know, it's easy to try to say, it's almost too easy of an answer to say, oh, it's this party and not that.
Oh, I didn't say party.
No,
I said leadership. I want to be very, very clear. This is not a politics
absolutely.
or party thing.
And,
this is a statement on leadership.
And I'm with you, but I'm just saying it's almost, I think what I'm saying is it's almost easier in some ways to say, I vote a certain way, therefore I'm enlightened on this issue.
Well, if
and
you
then
do that,
to turn
you're lazy
around,
and you're stupid, and you should be called out on it.
yeah, and that's my point with this lady in Central
Sorry,
Park.
I don't care who you are, what color you are, anything.
She
That's
clearly
trifling.
had that agenda, but then,
yeah.
I mean, we saw in video again how she treated that.
Anyone who would try to take that easy of an out, as I said, and when, you know, it's been heartening. Sunday was incredibly difficult. Monday was difficult. Today's been difficult. But I've had some friends reach out to me who said, okay, I don't get this. Tell me what's going on. What can I do? How can I help? I'll tell you, sometimes just listening. Being able to admit to somebody who's a friend of mine that I respect, you know what, I sit in my own damn house afraid, and I'm in the middle of working on a project, and I just break down in tears, and I have to step away from the desk and just sit and cry. You know, being able to express that. Hearing things that aren't comfortable. I mean, look, the reality is, there is a divide. There's been a divide in this country. The divide exists. The trappings change, but divide still exists. And as soon as we are willing to accept that and then start the dialogue, okay, fine. Now what do we do going forward? Then you start making progress. But I also understand that when 4 centuries of a way of life suddenly comes under attack, it's human nature that you're going to band together to protect it. So to go to your point about how is everyone, you know, how do you respond when everyone's branded and they get together? Well, that's the problem of our society right now. So with all due respect, I'm saying from leadership and us as Christian leaders in our households, of our congregations, of our small groups, of our businesses, if we're involved in business, we have to take that stand. And if someone wants to look for an equivocation or an out, we got to call them on it. There's a couple of realities. You may not personally hold those feelings, but the global world is this, and you need to acknowledge that and understand that while it may be for a short time uncomfortable for you, imagine what it's been like living through it for the last 4 friggin' centuries. At the point where that dialogue starts happening in small groups, podcasts like this, at the point where pastors like you have the courage to put something up for their congregation to see and be okay with people walking out at the end of the service. I mean, I watched all that happen. That's why I'm here. And I'm grateful for this because I feel good. This is the first time I felt good since Sunday morning when I started finally dealing with what was going on.
Well, let me make you feel bad for a second.
Oh, God.
So here's what can happen sometimes to a police officer. And I'm fortunate. I grew up in a predominantly white school district, but I had a father who would have none. He grew up in Aliquippa, and he would have none of being prejudiced. And I remember as a little boy having my mouth smacked, by my dad, and going, "Well, I know I'm not prejudiced because I'm not prejudiced."
I'm not going down that one anymore, right? But
what does happen is, and let me, maybe if I can put you in my shoes for a few minutes. So yesterday morning. It's time to go vote for my wife, and I have 2 5-year-old little boys, and my 5-year-old son just happens to be going through the phase right now of wearing his police costume absolutely everywhere he goes. And now he wants to go into downtown Ambridge with my wife and vote. And
Now you got to have
go,
a conversation with him like
and
I've been
he's
having with my godson.
Exactly. So, but I'm also familiar with, and I'll divide this out just for the sake of conversation, is I also know what it feels like to be on the streets in a very violent urban community and hearing the words because of what's happening. We are going to kill us an effing white cop tonight.
Yeah. And that's and that's wrong.
But here's what I'm allowed to do as a believer, is to desperately make every effort to say, this is not a racial issue that's happening here. This is a sin issue that is transpiring right before my eyes. And I know there's nothing that I could possibly say to this group of people that they're going to go, oh, I'm so sorry. We're going to just change our attitude right now because of something you said. There is something deeper that's going on that, as believers and able to see that happen from both a law enforcement perspective and a pastoral perspective, is how do we reconcile those things? What is the thing that can happen that can transform what is happening inside of communities? Because right now we're at a place in our country's history where we talk about having conversations, but we have more ability to have conversations right now than we have ever had.
Yep.
We see on the news every night, and on every pundit has an opinion, the right, the left, in between. The more conversation that is happening, it almost seems as though people are becoming more galvanized in their belief system, because seldom do you see somebody come onto one of these forums and do that same thing, like, oh, I came in here with a prejudgment or a stereotype, but now you have convinced me, and I am going to go home tonight and transform. Something larger has to happen.
Agreed. And I think that's absolutely where our combined faith comes in. We as a church were fortunate. We already had the technology in place. We literally, all we had to do was flip a switch when the world stopped spinning. I've read things that have said attendance online across the board in churches around the world has gone up some 10 to 20 fold. People are scared and they're leaning on God. There's a lot more believers and good people than there are bad actors. I think we all know it. I think as many people that are galvanizing, those are the cowards. They were going to be cowards anyway. And we need to call them as cowards. A friend of mine asked me today, what can I do? I said, you can have conversations like we're having right now with your family, with your coworkers, with your colleagues, with your friends, and you have to be prepared to lose some of them. My business partner's half Italian, half Jewish. We are on the phone all day long, and we've been having these conversations, and if there's an equivocation, my partner pulled the plug on a deal yesterday. They said, you know something, with all due respect, I'm not okay with where your heart is, and I'm watching my brother Gene suffer daily and be scared to come to my house. He said, and I'm not okay doing business with you, and I'm okay if we lose this deal. And it was done. Phone went dead. You know what I mean? And if you don't have the courage to put your comfort at risk, we are going to be having this conversation in 10 years. The people who galvanized, they were going to stay in their lane anyway. They didn't want to change, weren't going to change. But I think there's a lot more of us that recognize that there is something that we can do, and change does have to happen. And it's okay to be uncomfortable, because at the end of the day, I think God honors that.
Well, it's, George, I think the point that I heard you make, and I think, Gene, you're agreeing with this, is that the social fixes we need to keep striving for.
Absolutely.
But they're not the ultimate fix.
No.
That there's got to be an awakening to internal sin all the way around, that allows there to be a humbling to listen and to be open to transformation and to the Spirit of God changing hearts. What's probably challenging is again, there's been such a history that it is not easy probably for people who say, this has gone on far too long for me to say, where's my sin in anything? And it's not easy for people who've been in a position of privilege or power for a long time to say, why would I want to admit anything and have to give up anything? And so it really is, there's a humility that has to come. And that's what's missing in the current political discourse, obviously, is
Well, on both
everyone
sides.
just goes so hard to their side, and they keep having on the same guests. I mean, I try to listen to different news sources so that and read different sources so that I can hopefully find the truth somewhere in between.
At least, yeah, exactly. You
And,
get enough input that you can, pray for discernment, and then you can figure out what's what. And I think that's what we all try to do. I think the majority of people in this country are horrified by what's going on. I also think the majority of the people in this country don't have a clue of what to do, and they're scared to ask because it's a scary conversation. My prayer is that what's going on right now and what has gone on in the last couple of months is scarier to where people are willing, where a former cop and, a former white cop and a black construction worker can sit in a setting together, coming to each other with some humility and faith that we share. And we can recognize, man, we got problems. We aren't going to solve this today. I don't have a clue of how we figure this out.
Well, let me share something with you. This
Yeah.
is personal. I certainly have never shared this on film or anything like this, and I'm going to use a name. And this is not to make this about me, but I really believe that this is the power of the gospel. I was probably 25 years old, and I arrested this African-American fella. His name was Buddy Creech. I'll never forget Buddy as long as I live, and here's why. So I arrest Buddy. He gets in the back seat of my police car. He didn't give me any problem, but I did begin a conversation with him, and I shared the gospel with him. And in the back seat of my police car, Buddy Creech broke down and became a believer in Jesus Christ. So I had transported him a few times in the next months, and we talked and had conversation about the gospel. And I lost track of Buddy Creech, and it was 10 years later, I was in a head-on collision with a Mack truck.
Oh my goodness.
And I was in the trauma unit at Allegheny General Hospital, and one evening, the second day there, I was coming back from a CAT scan or something. I'm being wheeled into my room, and I see this figure standing by my window, and my family is with me, and they're like, excuse me, but can we help you? Here, it's Buddy Creech. Buddy Creech was the first person who visited me at the trauma unit at Allegheny General Hospital. And he said these words. He said, I want you to know, he told this to my parents, he said, I want you to know that 10 years ago, when I was in trouble, your son was there for me. And I heard about what happened to him yesterday, and I wanted to be here today for him.
Wow.
Now, I tell you that not to make that about me or about Buddy Creech, but it is the power of the gospel
Amen.
that began to transform that relationship and make something happen that probably typically you would not think would happen in the confines of a police
Sure.
cruiser.
Sure. Well, I think, again, I understood that.
Hey, buddy, if you're still alive, you reminded me of Morgan
God
Freeman.
bless him, man. That's an awesome story. And again, I think that's why we're all here. And I think that's the confidence that we do have. As I have been breaking down and crying, I've had, Christian music on. And at times it's the songs that come with the most hope that bring the emotion out. But at the end of the day, how blessed are we that we can cry out to Jesus and know that he's with us. I felt closer to God over these last days where I feel completely lost than I have in quite some time, because what I know is Christ is feeling that pain with me, and he is right there with me, and he is absorbing that. The fact that today I choose to go to God and go to men like you to talk this stuff through, that's where I can have a voice and where I can do something that matters other than just talk about it. Because if you root your response in Christ, then you can't go wrong, right? So,
Yeah.
thank you for.
Well, thank you
for
guys
this.
both for taking the time today, Gene, for just coming and sharing
Absolutely.
from your passion and heart and experience and perspective, George, from your heart and experience as well.
Yeah.
Certainly our hope is that the days ahead will be better than the days behind.
Well, I think what we have to do going forward is now we can work together. We can do some things together. I think we all are going to have an opportunity to say things and speak places and take a stand and just to say, listen, we got issues now. Both sides, we got to come together. It's not about right and wrong right now.
Yeah.
You know, so I'm grateful to you for coming and being willing to be here, and thanks for inviting me, Kurt.
Well, thanks for being here,
Well,
Gene.
thank you, and thank you for spending part of your day with us. If you have questions or topics you'd like to see addressed, if you'd like a follow-up conversation on this, feel free to send a question to askapastor@orchardhillchurch.com. There'll also be some other conversations you can probably find online that'll be happening around Orchard Hill in the days ahead. So thanks. Have a great day.
God bless everyone.